I will be reading here from a manuscript that I've elaborated over the past several years, starting 2013, in China, more precisely in Macau, at the University of Macau, in a program of philosophy and religious studies that was just beginning, actually. That was my mission. It is a kind of a mission following in the footsteps, really, of the Jesuit missionaries, in particular Matteo Ricci, who, starting in Macerata in Italy, through the Portuguese Jesuit mission to the East, passed into Macau. Macau is really where he learned his Chinese in preparation for going to the continent, eventually to the imperial court in Beijing. This really, in the early modern period, opened the door to China. And I'm taking Macau as having a kind of symbolic significance as the doorway, the gateway. In fact, the Chinese name is Ao Men. I'm sorry I can't show you that character, Men, because it's a double swinging door, like in the Western salons, ironically, but this is the double swinging door, which is the gateway between West and East. Macau has had that role historically, and I understood my mission in China to revive that role in a sort of renaissance of intercultural philosophy in the postmodern age, comparing the Western resources, which I had worked in exclusively to that point. The works that were just mentioned on What Cannot Be Said, it really is all entirely within the Western tradition, from Plato to postmodernism. So this was really a turn in an intercultural direction, but I saw an absolute necessity to take apophatic thinking this direction towards the East. I'd long been aware that apophatic insight is as strong and even stronger, really, in those Eastern traditions, the Advaita Vedanta, Taoism, various strains of Buddhism, certainly. So it was really to move apophatic thinking, such as I developed it to this point, into a key of intercultural philosophy. And I find the intercultural really to be a kind of revelation. And I want to say in this context particularly, a revelation of a sort of mystical dimension. Now, I think I'm going to begin reading from the preface of this manuscript to cue you into the overall project, which is a project really of rethinking philosophy and culture across historical ages and geographical continents through apophatic lenses, or in other words, through the perspective of negation, of what does not appear, of what is not and cannot be said. Right? The apophasis is simply the Greek word for negation. The apophatic thinking pursued here undertakes this task through bringing about its own metamorphosis into a programmatically intercultural philosophy. Right, the title, I think, it's on your program, Apophatic Paths from Europe to China, and then the subtitle of this manuscript is Regions Without Borders. And of course, then for this talk, I'm using the subtitle Method and Mysticism in Intercultural Philosophy. This philosophy entails attempting to think ideas not just within the bounds of a given cultural frame, with its inevitable background assumptions, but rather in unbounded ways in relation to other cultures and their different conceptual frameworks. Such thinking aims to negate, if not to neutralize, first one's own and finally any cultural framework. The possibility of relativizing culture per se by playing one culture off against the other, of stepping back and gaining critical perspective with respect to any and all cultural preconditioning, and then perchance of facing something absolute that is fleetingly glimpsed in the interstices between cultures, opens into a dimension that can perhaps be interpreted best as theological, or at least as religious, and of course in this context, I think we should say mystical in nature. This dimension has been the source of representations of divinity throughout the history of religions and in mythologies the world over. The uncircumscribable, unfathomable dimension intrinsic to experience as such is the real bugbear. This uncircumscribable dimension is the real bugbear making culture such a volatile, conflictual, apparatic, and unmasterable challenge for philosophical thinking, as well as for the multicultural, modern or modernizing societies that in our time are seen to be mushrooming all across the planet. Reflecting on culture philosophically is not just a matter of comparing different forms and variants of manifest phenomena. More fundamentally, it entails sounding out the ungraspable ground of all cultural expressions, whether this abyss is imagined as residing in human nature and its inalienable freedom, exceeding the confines of any possible definition of identity, or in language, with its differential structure opening to infinity, or in a divine endowment and destiny that transcends human knowing. This is what we were talking about yesterday as the unground, der Ungrund, as another figure for this mystical dimension of reality. Now, we are creatures of culture even before we are self-consciously aware as subjects or agents, and centrally at stake in the philosophy of culture, most conspicuously since the Enlightenment, is the question of universality. And the work that I'm now presenting, I really see as part of a larger project, some of which has been published, more of which I hope to be able to turn out in the future. The title of that larger umbrella is really The Universality of What Is Not, the apophatic turn in critical thinking. So universality is going to be a fundamental coordinate in the method, or in the considerations, the reflections on method in philosophy and theology that I'm offering here. And of course, I'm not differentiating very strongly, especially in the Chinese context. Philosophy and theology are really different inflections of the quest for wisdom, and they will run together very much in my way of thinking. This universality, however, does coincide with unique personal experience, with the singular. This is a paradoxical coincidentia oppositorum. But the closer we come to this nothing that is constitutive of each of us, really, as singular individuals, the more the universal emerges as well. We cannot really be identified with any specific character traits, whether generic or very individual. Every property is something that myriad other individuals can and do possess. It's really that singularizing nothing, which is the core of each of us, that is also, paradoxically, the universal where we are one. And I think that is what we are trying to glimpse in some way in pursuing the mystical. Now, I want to offer a little bit more insight into my method here of intercultural philosophy. I've given you just a brief perspective on the autobiographical introduction to this project. Then there is also an introduction to an intercultural philosophy of universalism and to just try and encapsulate a couple of ideas. We have only our cultures with their symbols and concepts and rites and practices to work from in our attempt to articulate and communicate our experience of the real. The comparison of cultures brings out the effects of their mediation of anything and everything that can be considered as real or absolute, that is, as reaching beyond historical and cultural contingencies. Such comparison enables us to discern each culture's specific possibilities, its characteristic decisions, and its symptomatic exclusions. The intercultural becomes itself a kind of revelation once we recognize the cultural relativity of all our conceptualities. And at a minimum, this interculturality is a revelation of unrevealability, the barriers to understanding across cultures. All cultural grammars and vocabularies are seeking to mediate or are in any case referred to a common undifferentiated whole or ambit that envelops us all already before we can define or differentiate it or even conceive of our particular questions and specific angles of vision. We share a common world. And that we is really pretty much without restrictions. Even other species share this world with us. This holds whether the enveloping ambit is considered to be real or virtual, ultimate or proximate, everyday or sacred and sublime. What is aimed at and projected here is the perspective of globality, with the proviso that globality requires the negation of every mere perspective, including recursively the negator's own. This negation is thus actually a negation of negation and opens into unlimited affirmation, an open embrace of all that is positively present in any culture taken as a means of reaching out beyond itself. Recognizing the otherness of cultures and recognizing culture per se as introducing a factor of alterity, then, is necessary in order that we may distinguish ourselves and our representations from the absolutely real, from that which simply is, so as to perceive it as such and relate ourselves to it consciously as other than ourselves and our own reflections. We need to become conscious of culture in order to look beyond it, to what it is not, to the strangeness of what asserts itself as real beyond our cultural and conceptual grasp, beyond our linguistic shaping and molding. And there is nothing quite like the experience of intercultural difference to provoke this search and to induce us to seek after this widened, deepened outlook. Of course, any distinction between the absolutely real and our own only relative grasp of it can be made only within language, and therefore also from within a culture, since language is always embedded within culture. Nevertheless, such a distinction between the absolute and the relative proves to be necessary for any given language as soon as it reflects on the unsurpassable incompleteness of its own actual formulations and their inability to exhaust the infinity of possible expressions. A language cannot exhaustively formulate the contextual whole to which it is beholden and which informs its every expression. It cannot completely or explicitly say all that it means, all that is conveyed by means of it. Language resorts instead to indirect forms of expression, such as metaphor and analogy, in order to suggestively refract, through particular images, this unencompassable whole context that bears on its meaning. Characteristic of such metaphorical modes is that they always allow and invite further formulations, highlighting other untold aspects of their subject that remain relatively unilluminated from the particular angle of vision enabled by any one image. Each particular culture is distinguished by the choice of metaphors it privileges for approaching the real, while the real as such remains in excess of its construal within any given culture's conceptual framework. That's all very general. I do want to focus on China now, although that's only an example, and my objective is not really to give us a more precise description of the bases of Chinese culture at all. That description of an object is really not what's at stake in the kind of methodological reflection that I'm engaging in here. I'm really aiming at the extra-cultural and the ultra-cultural. It's that mystical dimension that I'm trying to enable us to touch on, really. By illusion, I want to open that dimension that I think we can call the mystical. Now, in order to do this, my whole project is actually conceived as a dialogue with François Jullien, the distinguished French philosopher and sinologist. And of course, he is a very original philosopher in his own right, and that gets him into trouble with sinologists very often because they are trying to describe an object more accurately than their peers. And actually, Jullien is aping them very often in that, even though what's really at stake in his work, certainly as I read it, is the apophatic, the unsaid and the unsayable. And that is not quite programmatic with him. But China and classical Chinese thinking, as his works reveal it to us, is the epitome of the apophatic. That's why I really take up with Jullien. He enables us, really, to engage the philosophical thinking of China. So, as I say, dialogue and debate, because in some ways I'm really at loggerheads with Jullien, even though I insist, again, he is the one that really opens this entire world for me. In fact, he does say that when he was trained first in ancient philosophy, and he read Plato and Aristotle for what they were saying and trying to discern exactly their doctrines. When he had then acquired Chinese, he began reading the Greeks for what they were not saying, for what was carried along in their discourse without really being thought upon and reflected, and that was the more decisive aspect, really, of their thinking. So that is really an apophatic method on his part as well. However, Jullien is using intercultural philosophy, really, as a way of overcoming the discourse of transcendence. China has really had this emblematic value since the 18th century. The empire without God, right, was the symbolic significance, really, of China, a totally unified administrative system and even a system of thinking with no need for God. This was the revelation, really, for Christian Wolff. Even Leibniz sees China through these lenses. There's much more there in Leibniz as well, because he is theist. And Jullien is following, really, in very much, I think, in this tradition, whereas I really want to see the intercultural, as I've said, as a revelation of transcendence. For just, that word is inadequate as any word is, but this dimension of the unsayable. cultures are related to one another, according to Julien, not just by their mutual similarities, but more importantly, by the gap, écart, that makes them heterogeneous and prevents any third term from subsuming them in a synthesis. Under this condition, their interaction is not guided or controlled by any superior kind of normativity, but is rather endlessly open to adventure. They cannot, as such, even be properly compared, as if a neutral frame and criteria for doing so could be given independently. Instead, they must be allowed simply to interact and so to mutually transform one another. They are not only different, but more importantly, distant from each other, and they can effectively operate transformatively upon one another because of that distance. Nonetheless, Julien's exposition of Chinese thought proceeds, in effect, by defining and discussing differences. What else can students of culture of whatever kind do? Many Westerners have observed, for example, that the Chinese language and culture excels in its aptitude to express continuous transition and interaction, whereas European languages are capable of envisaging transcendence of substance, substrate, or subject, with a sublimity of construction unattainable for the Chinese. The Chinese language, as it has been described by Western philosophers, from Wilhelm von Humboldt to Julien, is characterized by its lack of morphological structure, that is, a grammatical inflection or of a systematic scheme of variations. Its relatively isolated monosyllabic characters strike the mind with force as individual images or impressions, whose meaning is less qualified and contoured by syntactical connection with other characters. The Chinese character, therefore, is more dependent on extralinguistic context, the situation of enunciation, for determination of its exact meaning in a sentence. The lack of a transcendent position outside of the two interacting, mutually transforming cultures turns into a cardinal principle of Julien's intercultural method. It turns out to serve as a hobby horse for expression of a certain anti-theological polemic that consistently animates Julien's work, just as it drives the agendas of numerous Parisian philosophers along with those of other secular-minded philosophers as well. Julien is anxious to assert, against certain typical and still widespread representations of naive theism, that there is no God controlling things from outside. Presumably, the Jesuit missionaries imagined and may have projected such a God onto Chinese cosmology. There is only an imminent development and interaction from within the encounter among distinct cultures. Interpreting immanence this way is closed to theological transcendence, so as to assert human and secular autonomy and self-sufficiency, repeats the Enlightenment impulse par excellence. It risks slipping into reenactment of the quintessential gesture of human self-empowerment through denial of any higher powers. A similar gesture, apparently, of human self-confidence surprises us also in Julien's very Hegelian embrace of the idea of the total intelligibility of culture. However, this is where I suspect that Julien is no longer thinking in consonance with the Chinese classics. For their vision does remain open to a dimension of transcendence that reaches beyond what is humanly and culturally intelligible. It is a dimension that cannot be grasped conceptually, and yet it lends itself to being variously figured as sacred and divine. It is acknowledged in a spirit that can sometimes be impudent, as when it lashes out in certain withering paradoxes of the Chuang-Tzu. It can also don highly reverent styles as diverse as those of Lao-Tzu and Confucius, each in their own ways deferentially honoring heaven, Tian, or the ancients. Julien frequently makes the point that in Chinese tradition, all theistic conceptions of heaven as a personal agent disappear from early on, from about a millennium before Christ during the Zhou dynasty. They are replaced, so this story goes, by images of natural transformation in accordance with the binary, yin and yang. However, likewise, at the heart of Christian theism and of monotheism generally, all images of God are placed under erasure within the negative theological currents that constantly counterpoint positive, cataphatic, dogmatic theology and subject all images to an uncompromising critique of representation as idolatrous. The exigency of relinquishing all claims to an adequate representation or intellectual conception of divinity, and of starting rather from the embodied experience of God incarnate in Christ, hews very near to the underlying inspiration of Christian revelation. For all the profound differences between Chinese and Western culture, surely neither one is wholly deprived of all relation to the transcendent and absolute, or the infinite and unsayable. However different the negotiation of the impossible task of grasping and articulating it may be in one cultural universe or the other. Julien's own work clearly demonstrates this, malgré lui, in spite of himself. The greater wisdom lies not in opposing transcendence to immanence, nor in simply rejecting the theological and thereby entering into an oppositional logic. As Julien himself acutely shows, a culture consists in polarities rather than just in unilateral character traits. Europe is constituted, historically, by its Christian heritage and by atheism as an essential expression of its widespread and deeply rooted secular humanism. Only through such interpenetrating and reciprocal poles do cultures become intelligible. Only so do their implicit bases of understanding, Julien's fond d'entente, emerge. The dia of dialogue stresses the need for the antithetical, whereas the logos stands for, quote Julien here, the fact that all cultures hold in common among themselves a communicability in principle. Julien pushes this latter conviction further to the point of claiming that all that is cultural is intelligible without loss or residue, sans perte et sans résidu. That's the claim, which seems somewhat exaggerated and perhaps unrealistic. And I would like to emphasize that this residue of unintelligibility has to be located really between cultures rather than within any one of them. I think this is where the limit of Julien's apophaticism declares itself, right, in his statement, and where he becomes perhaps something of an uncritical believer in the Enlightenment ideals that have been so influential throughout European and more generally modern history, especially as they emanate in certain essentials from the French philosophes in the 18th century. Julien's belief in the total intelligibility of culture induces him to exclude the idea of anything in culture remaining definitively beyond verbal reach, namely the idea of an ineffable of culture. Those are his words. L'idée d'un ineffable de la culture. In Le Pont des Singes, I've actually been working from De l'Universel. This is one of Julien's titles, and now I'm adding in Le Pont des Singes. Julien continues his attack on the notion of the ineffable specifically in relation to culture. There is no cultural ineffable. Those again are his words. He repeats this thesis verbatim in his manifesto, L'écart et l'ombre. This formulation is correct to the extent that what is ineffable is precisely not cultural. There I agree. Nevertheless, this does not mean that an ineffable instance or even insistence cannot condition culture throughout its whole extent, and that therefore the ineffable can be dismissed from a philosophy of culture. There are, in fact, important incidences of limits of such intelligibility that have been designated as cultural untranslatability and have been extensively analyzed as such. There's a volume on the translatability of cultures. It's introduced by an essay by Sanford Budig on crises of alterity, cultural untranslatability. Jan As Jan Assmann is part of this as well. Julien's objection is that with such an idea as its untranslatability, the culture exits from then on from the intelligible. This is to say that in embracing the ineffable, a cultural discourse no longer holds itself to be participable by a common intelligence. And this, I'm quoting in these words from Julien. I'm translating. The work of dialogue is abandoned. All right, those are his complaints. This renunciation seems to Julien to be tantamount to a giving up of responsibility. For once dialogue is renounced or transcended, one is no longer answerable to others, no longer accountable to make oneself intelligible to them. Right? This is what he fears. At this point, one appeals to some higher instance, such as divinity, that justifies one in terms beyond those that can be explained to one's human fellows in common language and dialogue. However, it would be more accurate to say not that the work of dialogue is abandoned by turning toward transcendence in recognition of certain limits of intelligibility, but rather that this work remains always and necessarily incomplete. Julien himself, after all, champions an activity of translation without limits. Translation, he declares, is the operativity proper to dialogue and the only possible global ethic. Translation is constitutive of European culture, unlike the Chinese, according to Julien, which was not seriously confronted with any other language of culture besides its own until the 19th century and forced colonialism on a massive scale. Yet translation, precisely because it is infinite and without any intrinsic limit, relates inevitably to the ineffable. This limit of what cannot be said is what truly bonds all cultures in their orientation to a never-exhaustible plenitude. This is what unites them beyond any specific traits that they may share in common. In affirming the infinity of translation, Julien himself touches upon the dimension that I call theological. The infinite, as the ultimate concern of negative theology, can be analogously indicated, imitated, and embodied by the endless striving of human works towards their unrealizable goals. Julien is undoubtedly correct that a certain ideal of translatability is indeed necessary in order to keep the work of giving account of our reasons on the move. And this can be, and in fact always is, only a work of approximation. Total intelligibility of the real, of anything more than a formal abstract model, is not attainable or hardly even conceivable, except as an ideal. I heartily agree with Julien's resistance to the premature closing down of ongoing cultural mediation in exchange for myths of untranslatable essences of national character or identity. But that does not automatically eliminate all penumbra of indetermination or overdetermination at the limits of sense. Quite the contrary. Translation may well lead to the threshold of untranslatable pure language. This is Walter Benjamin's Die reine Sprache in his essay, right, on die Aufgabe des Übersetzers, the task of the translator. Precisely what cannot be translated is what becomes mystically manifest in the process of translation itself. Translation of a literary classic can promote it to a higher life, an afterlife, Nachleben, through its being made to exist in another language besides the original one in which it is created and born. This potential growth stands for the fact that translation is not simply a closed circle of immanence. There can be even more, in certain respects, in the translation than in the original. In spite of this fact, a mostly tacit thesis that there is nothing that is not culture runs through Julien's works and thought. It is an equivalent or a corollary of his taking an anti-theological stance. God or a divine absolute would presumably be an instance outside of and beyond culture and would thus delimit and relativize cultural discourse. Such a superhuman instance would seem to disempower humans in a way that Hegel was unwilling to accept and Julian no more than he. Yet ancient Chinese wisdom does pivot on this relatability of everything human to what is above humanity and its grasp. This higher instance might be called nature, or at least nature's ground, Dao, or Tian, or Fo, which would be the Buddhist being, the Buddha being, but it might just as well be called God, indeed, Deus sive natura. The name is not really important, not ultimately anyway, since this unsayable, inconceivable whatever cannot in principle be named, even though it is fundamental in and to all that is human. The Tao that can be named is not the constant or the universal Tao. Tao kui Tao, fei cheng Tao. Julian's positioning of himself in opposition to theological transcendence is, to my mind, complicit with the theory of Western atheism and is not truly informed by classic Chinese wisdom. Its closest kinship and more organically related analogues might rather be found in the insistence on immanence, for example, by Gilles Deleuze. Indeed, Deleuze absolutizes immanence to the point where it becomes itself transcendent of every possible frame and figure of thought. Of course, behind Deleuze you have Spinoza and the Stoics. Classic Chinese wisdom, too, champions a total openness even to what transcends thought, and therewith every frame of thinking. And that is exactly where I locate the indispensable movement of negative theology. Julien presents the most fundamental Chinese text of all, the I Ching, the Book of Changes, as a manifesto of immanence in figure d'immanence. But the all-inclusiveness of immanence must not be allowed to exclude transcendence once the latter is understood apophatically as the unthinkable and as having no fixed form of representation. Julien does, in a Heideggerian spirit, make space for the unthought, l'impensé, and perhaps even for the unthinkable, but he resists according it any kind of substantial existence. That would be an unwarranted hypostatization. And yet, in this, he is perfectly in agreement with a negative theological handling of this issue, which is not to be confounded with positing an abstract metaphysics. Negative theological thinking is much closer to thinking in terms of what Julien calls operativity or effectivity. God is not known except by means of and in terms of divine effects. We have this in Aquinas. Negative theology makes no claim to grasping transcendence through any formal vocabulary. It critiques instead, as idolatrous, all substantifications of divinity. As infinitely and concretely real, divinity is ungraspable and inconceivable. There is in negative theology no pretension to possession of a superior code for the ultimate secret of the universe. It is only the constantly shifting vocabularies of human cultures that can gesture toward this dimension beyond their grasp. Evidently, this unidentifiable factor that some, notably Jacques Lacan, call the real, can never be made exhaustively intelligible. It therefore does not belong to the sphere of culture in Julien's view, if for him culture is totally intelligible. And yet to cleanly separate it from culture, relegating it to pure transcendence, or else denying its pertinence altogether, marks a limit to thinking holistically that need not be accepted, except perhaps in inevitably certain pragmatic contexts, but not in principle and as a matter of theory. I agree with Julien completely in his advocacy of an open universal that is maintained by the deployment of negation, and also with the idea that this brings about the self-critical self-reflection of the human. Just such reflection is urgently necessary in order to interrupt and resist the narcissistic auto-reflex that is characteristic of modernity and that is still gaining ground in producing ever greater uniformity everywhere on the planet today. Against cognitivisms and their supposedly given universals, which are really only artificially reproduced uniformities. The only valid method for Jullien is inquiry into the gap between cultures that guides human thought to genuine self-reflection. This position is a compelling critique, but in his enthusiasm for this Enlightenment ideal, Jullien tends to flatten out its self-critical edge. Human self-reflection is perhaps not itself without a certain vis-a-vis upon the non-human and the supra-cultural. Its self-negating spirit can acknowledge what is not only just another form of human culture, but is also unimaginably not itself, not human at all, the other of all others, that is, of all possible humanly experienceable others. This might be another and even more extreme degree of that someplace else of thought, of which Jullien wistfully writes in a reprise of his and Foucault's notion of heterotopy. Let me emphasize that it is really in the negative, that culture itself opens as an abyss, that this realm of imagination of the wholly other opens up. So I don't really want to posit the other, the supercultural, the non-human, except as the intrinsic porosity, one might say, the lack that is dwelling within all of our cultural concepts, constructs. This other transcending our thoughts and ways would be difficult for Jullien to acknowledge without releasing some inveterate prejudices against theology and its figures of transcendence, prejudices that are widespread and deeply rooted among the left-bank Parisian intelligentsia. Such an anti-clerical consensus excludes God and refuses to acknowledge any inscrutable, unintelligible divineness at the source of all human experience and intelligibility. This is where Jullien seems to take his stand with Hegel and a totalizing rationality against Kierkegaard's recognition of absolute paradox and an other beyond all possibility of mediation. His assertion of the total intelligibility of culture wishes not to acknowledge that there could be anything which is not cultural, or at least not culturally mediated. And yet he tends to forget or ignore, on just this point, the inherent negativity of the cultural itself. It's disappearing, like everything human, towards what it is not. The assertion of the total intelligibility of culture effectively excludes a certain positive conception of the theological, but it is also at risk of failing to acknowledge the unknowing and unintelligibility, at least to us, here and now, at the heart of culture. This acknowledgement is crucial pragmatically to opening us all radically to dialogue, and so to genuinely seeking enlightenment from one another. Poets from Hölderlin to Celan show excruciatingly how our wounds are the authentic openings permitting communication between human beings, who are themselves understood as a conversation heard from one another. This is Hölderlin, hören voneinander. And in this respect, a certain inescapable woundedness is witness to what I interpret as a theological dimension of humanity's being torn open to what it neither knows nor can possess. Acknowledging unknowing has become the overriding imperative, particularly of certain forms of postmodern thinking. I'm inclined to think that it is not the infinite mystery of things as such, but only human codifications of this mystery in institutions and ideologies exerting power over people, and sometimes inciting to violence, that arouses opposition in Jullien and in other thinkers who are adamantly anti-theological. What they are rejecting in the end, however, are only the empty vessels and ritual paraphernalia of theology, not its deeper sense and apophatic purport as negative theology. What Jullien offers is a philosophy of culture. This might be seen as an alternative to and as spelling the demise of metaphysical philosophy and its often undeclared crypto-theology. Rather than claiming to have a transcendental viewpoint from which to evaluate the truth of a culture's enunciations and expressions in its arts and sciences and discourses in general, a philosophy of culture abides within the immanence of these symbolic, systemic, and aesthetic expressions. It eschews claiming access to any superior plane of transcendent knowledge and truth. This sort of positioning of Julien's philosophy seems to give it a clear point and message in terms of what it is not, through stubborn opposition to all theological forms of transcendence-oriented rationality. However, in reality, the polemic against theology serves as a crutch for propping up Julien's discourse. His argument is made to stand up by virtue of what it opposes. More deeply considered, theology must also be taken as itself just a form of human culture, perhaps even as the most essential and representative and self-revealing form of such culture. What distinguishes theology in its truest shape and manifestation is its sensibility for the negation of culture per se, as demanded by the spirit of uncompromising self-critique. There is a sort of self-critical denial of culture inasmuch as it is just a human construction that is expressed in the recognition of divinity as transcending and creating and as rendering possible humanity and its world. This imagination of a divinity who is even more a subject than we, more conscious than any human consciousness, or than any consciousness that is humanly conceivable, pursues the possibilities of the most radical self-negation beyond the logic of concepts into the unfathomable depths opened by human imagination, brought face to face with its own abyss. Yet this claim can and must be understood also in purely immanent terms, simply as negating the closure and supposed sufficiency unto itself of any identifiable, conceptualizable, immanent sphere. Theology's relevance, then, consists in its forcing every cultural paradigm, with its inevitable human limits, into a movement of self-surpassing. Theology, understood thus as fundamentally negative theology, does not impose another content coming from elsewhere, but rather forces every finite cultural content to its limits, where it must give up its own achieved form and open into other forms that are as yet unachieved and perhaps unprecedented. Theology is a form of culture and can itself become eminently a form of the philosophy of culture. It can do so because negative theology, by virtue of its unsparing critique of every form of representation, can force culture to embrace, or at least to confront, its own absolute and inconceivable other. It can thus become most radically other than itself, turning into, among other things, a negative theology of culture. This mutual implication of culture and theology, or more exactly of humanism and the heavenly, at the self-negating limits of either discourse, is provocatively expressed by the Taoist classic Chuang-Tzu in the most bare-bones and yet essential terms. I quote, "Our understanding can be in the right only by virtue of a relation of dependence on something, and what it depends on is always peculiarly unfixed. So how could I know whether what I call heavenly is not really the human? How could I know whether what I call the human is not really the heavenly?" The impossibility of fixing the absolute in our language makes any distinction in language between the absolute and the relative, the heavenly and the human, itself merely relative. The two cannot but operate inseparably in our thought and speech. Absoluteness is never conceived by us otherwise than as our idea, with part of the arbitrariness that this inevitably entails. To speak of the heavenly is unavoidably to speak, at least implicitly, also of, and in any case from, the human with its constitutive limits. The Confucian classic Zhongyong bears a comparable message concerning the virtue of absolute genuineness or extreme honesty, Cheng, as permanent and perfect, as infinite and endless. Such human perfection is an endowment from heaven, as the groundless ground, Julien would say, fond, sans fond, of the world, the horizon which exceeds and surpasses all human experience in the direction of the unconditioned or absolute. Julien consistently recognizes this, but then his emphasis is always on bringing the opening to transcendence and heaven back down to earth so as to ground it in immanence. He writes as if the latter were more securely possessed. Even if that were the case, still in the spirit of especially Taoist wisdom, it is only by releasing our hold on all supposedly known quantities of experience that we allow them to live and evolve, and ourselves with them. Along these lines, Julien himself maintains that in classical Chinese thought, experience surpasses itself. But he adds the caveat, without consummating the rupture of its sensory manifestation and without completely parting company with the logic of processes. Julien thereby marks out some important guideposts that are highly relevant for the future development of apophatic thought today. In particular, the apophatic project is being pursued today with a focus on the body and on incarnation in worldly historical processes, which at the same time unsettle history and dismantle all its teleologies. For apophatic thinking, too, transcendence cannot be thought in itself or positively, but only relationally, that is, in relation to forms of immanence such as the body. Bodily, incarnate, sensory forms of transcendent life are crucial to apophatic thinking from the beginning of Christian tradition, receiving explicit theorization already with Tertullian's 206 AD treatise on Christ's flesh, De Carne Christi. Conversely, however, immanence cannot be thought without the acknowledgement of transcendence. Otherwise, the real is reduced to a mere husk of itself, since as self-contained, it is lifeless and empty. Cut off from transcendence, and thus from relation to its outside and other, far from being the inexhaustible resource that Julien celebrates, immanence suffocates and stifles because it is self-enclosed and isolated from the infinite circulation and exchange of all with all. This is why we have so much imagery of fecundity, really, with respect to the Godhead as well. Kabbalah came up yesterday, and it's rich, really, in all these traditions. Julien's understanding of immanence, like Deleuze's, actually presupposes transcendence, and most obviously self-transcendence, as the very principle that keeps immanence alive and on the move. Indeed, I'm going to try and cut things down. I think I have just a few more minutes here, and I will try to come to a conclusion. Thus, it is not transcendence that need not be recognized as absolutely decisive, but rather that it cannot be grasped and thereby represented as such. Neither, however, can immanence or nature be so grasped and represented, since they are without specifiable or delimited foundations in themselves. They are each gaping open to their other, which cannot but be called transcendent, even if only admittedly with an inevitable degree of impropriety, since strictly speaking, this outside or beyond is not properly nameable. What I'm going to skip over here is really l'immanence une vie, the final testament of Gilles Deleuze, which does, I think, illuminate more of what Julien is trying to do, and really the coincidence of transcendence and immanence in their thinking, even though they really do place it very much under the aegis of immanence. It's an immanence that I believe implodes, that cracks open from within to this abyss that I'm calling the mystical or the apophatic. I think that there is really a margin of personal choice as to whether one identifies with immanence, une vie. Why that is the right label for Deleuze, I think is not really philosophically justifiable, or not pure. It can't be justified in purely philosophical terms, but becomes really a matter of identity, personal choice, and faith See, there I think he really is making a declaration of faith more than a philosophical proposition. Very similarly, Julien's reasoning, and I'm really going back to the whole argument about the intercultural dialogue, the exclusion of ineffability. I think that Julien's reasoning is that in order to be responsible to one another, we need to eliminate the transcendence of God, since that claim to another pretended and purportedly absolute responsibility threatens to undermine the real and concrete claims of unconditioned responsibility that we bear to one another. My view is that in order to do justice to this infinite responsibility to one another, we need to acknowledge an unknowing and unintelligibility, at least to us, at its heart. We need to learn from one another how to be responsible to each other, and this we can do only by opening to an unknown beyond what any of us can possibly know or control. This is so because our thinking is always finite and as such systemically insufficient and needs to be critiqued. It needs to be subjected indeed to infinite self-critique. Negative theology is the acknowledgement that this critique is answerable to an instance such as nature or divinity that I cannot fathom or comprehend, but in and from which I nevertheless arise and remain beholden to, inescapably and unconditionally. So there I will rest my case uneasily, breaking off in anticipation of your unrest. Thank you.
Well, I'm Victoria Harrison, until very recently of the University of Glasgow, but now of the University of Macau. So I have also followed Professor Franke, or as I refer to him sometimes, William of Macau, through the sliding door between the West and the East. So it's fitting, I think, that I have the privilege of giving a very brief comment to the wonderful paper that we've all just heard. And thank you in advance for your indulgence here. I know that you all will have many important questions, so I will keep my comments brief. And mostly I'll be using this as an opportunity to raise some of the questions that I have about the project as a whole. So, as I see it, the wider project that Professor Franke is engaged in here is rethinking philosophy and culture through the process of negation. And his goal is to provide us with a way of thinking beyond all cultural norms. Thought is to somehow become unbound by any particular cultural framework. So this is a very ambitious and exciting goal. But I think it's important to recognize that this isn't, in any usual sense of the word, a project within comparative philosophy. It's actually more aptly characterized as a project within post-comparative philosophy. And I think that's quite an important point to note. This work is going well beyond the typical strategy of comparative philosophy or comparative religious studies or theology, which compares different traditions with one another. We're leaving that well behind with the kind of project that we've been introduced to this morning. And in the context of our own conference here, with our interest in comparative mysticism, we should be clear that what we're now concerned with is actually post-comparative mysticism. Now, the object of this post-comparative mysticism, as I understand it, is, according to Professor Franke, the absolute that's been the source of representations of divinity in different cultures. Now, I'm going to use the word absolute, although there are other words that could be used in its place. But just to keep this simple, I'll talk about the absolute. Now, Franke claims that each culture is distinguished by the chain of metaphors that it uses to approach this absolute. And the question I think that this raises for him is where his own metaphors are coming from. So particularly when he uses language such as the beyond, talking of the absolute as beyond language or what is beyond culture, he's using a spatial metaphor, the metaphor of beyond. But where is that coming from? In which culture is that grounded in? Other terms, other metaphors which are used are emerging from a common reality, enveloping us. So I'd like to hear more about the origin, the location, philosophically and culturally, of these metaphors. Now, one of the key questions which Professor Franke's work raises is what lies beyond words or beyond culture. So again, notice that key spatial metaphor of beyond. The use of that metaphor, I think, is suggestive of a dimension or a realm which is outside, again, another spatial metaphor, outside the realm of representation. So it seems then that we actually have two levels, two different theoretical levels at work here. Firstly, we have a level of representation. On this level, language functions more or less effectively to represent things within the finite realm of our experience. But then we also have a separate theoretical level, and that's the level of whatever is beyond. And this is where our language cannot function adequately to represent what is. Now, this raises two big questions, I think. The first question is, why do we assume, or why should we assume, that there actually is anything beyond representation in this sense? Is the answer that in positing this, in making this assumption, we thereby gain some explanatory power? If so, what is it that will be explained by this route? Now, the second big question is, why assume that whatever is beyond is an undifferentiated whole? Why might we not be faced with a regression of different levels of beyondness? Or, to put this another way, different absolutes lying behind different cultural expressions? Why assume that we are going to have one thing at the end of this analysis, or one no thing? Professor Franke claims that beyond words, what we have is an undifferentiated nothing, and words cannot adequately express this nothing. The same nothing can be discerned beyond each culture's characteristic forms of expression. So these are key claims within the project as a whole. But again, why assume that it is one and the same no thing? To put the question slightly differently, what grounds the assumption of universality, which is so fundamental, I think, to this post-comparative project as a whole? Leaving that set of issues aside, The second major theme that I wanted to raise here was the idea of the movement of double transcendence. Professor Franke seems to be claiming that post-comparative philosophy involves a movement which can be described as a movement of double transcendence. So what is this? Well, first, the first transcendence is transcendence of our own cultural framework. That's our first movement of separation from the familiar. The second transcendence is a transcendence of all cultural frameworks. So once we've gone beyond one, our own, we then reach a vantage point from which we can go beyond all. Now, I should say, very sympathetic to this approach, and I'm intrigued by the project as a whole. But I think it raises, though this aspect of it raises an important question. If the apophatic insight can be attained through any cultural framework, as I think Professor Franke would say, what exactly is it that we're gaining by running the post-comparative analysis to the second level of transcendence? So what do we gain, more specifically, in our understanding of the absolute by going through this double transcendence? What does the intercultural perspective add, in other words, to our understanding of the absolute? If the resources for thinking of the infinite or the absolute are to be found within each cultural tradition, then it's not clear what we can gain by spreading our horizons and looking into the resources available in different cultures. There's an image that I think reveals the problem. Think of the absolute or the infinite or the no thing as a seam of gold, undifferentiated gold. Now think of a series of gold mines, the gold mines representing different cultures. Whichever mine we go down, we're going to arrive at the same thing, the undifferentiated gold. If the gold really is undifferentiated, how will it help us to go down more mines than one? That's the issue that I'd like to hear some response to. And finally, I wondered if what the post-comparative approach that Professor Franke has outlined, what it can actually teach us about the absolute or the infinite. Is its purpose to give us a new way of thinking about different cultural frameworks? Is it to inform us about those? Or is it to inform us about the nature or the non-nature of whatever it is that lies beyond? If it's the latter, I'm not quite sure how it is going to be informative of the absolute, although it's clearly going to be very informative of the cultural frameworks and their conceptual possibilities and limitations. So these were some of the questions which I wanted to raise about this fascinating project. And I don't know if Professor Franke wants to respond.
Yeah, no, that was absolutely fascinating for me to hear this response. I had no idea what to expect, and the way I hear it is this is philosophy speaking with mysticism in a certain sense, that philosophy is bringing its questions back to what was perhaps a mystical rhapsody in some of the terms that Victoria has just underlined. I think you're absolutely right that this is post-comparative philosophy, and I think that's a very illuminating way to put it. Nevertheless, I wouldn't think that this leaves comparison behind so much as breaks comparison open. It undoes comparison, but comparison is still there really as the necessary means for opening the kind of post-comparative insight that I'm aiming for. And of course, I'm using these terms, spatial metaphors, as is pointed out. I think one way to think of those spatial metaphors is not in purely static terms of things outside one another. They're verbs as well. Kenneth Burke analyzes specifically beyond as beyonding, right? I think that's one way to begin to limber up these terms. To they don't have fixed reference. They facilitate thinking and thinking. Okay, thinking beyond. It's not as if the beyond is going to consolidate and crystallize in something or even nothing. They are movements of thought. Even the whole is never grasped as a whole. It remains an ideal, but it does orient us. And see, the idea of the whole is simply that we're oriented with no limitation towards others, all others. We think of it first in social terms, and then it can also be a theological other as well. But it is whole, not because I can define a concept of the whole, but because I cannot set any limits to the others that I'm engaging. It's an undefined whole. It's a non-concept of wholeness, and really this is the kind of universality that I'm advocating, and it is not a Hegelian universal of A is not A. There's no exclusion in it. That is really the point of this non-conceptual or ultra-conceptual type of universality that I want to advocate. And I find extremely intriguing the kinds of distinctions that Professor Harrison makes, these two movements in the double transcendence. That's very, very interesting. I find it artificial in the end, nevertheless, that the distinction between the cultural framework, well, that's actually the third point. The transcendence of our own cultural framework, to my mind, is already in some way a transcendence of cultural frameworks per se. The intercultural is only a contingent stimulus. I will grant that. A contingent stimulus to a opening of the mind, really, without the limits of any one culture, and that's representative. It is philosophically, I think, very interesting to separate those two steps, but that's not the way it works, I think, when you're actually thinking. Now, just one more point on that. We do want to let other people in as well. I would have a similar type of response to the third point. What is this way of thinking going to teach us about, I don't know, the absolute? Can it be informative about the beyond, or is it only informative of our cultural frameworks? Again, for me, that's an artificial kind of distinction. It's not as if this beyond absolute transcendence can be grasped in those terms or in any terms, but it's a dimension of our experience as we do come to cognizance of the limits of our various cultural frameworks. So I very much, I am fascinated by the work of philosophy in making these kinds of distinctions and to see how they then collapse together in the more mystical type of thinking that I discover I'm on the track of is, a further example to me of how this is a post-comparative philosophical thinking. I thank you very much.
Well, thank you both professors for your illuminating representation. What I wanted to say was that often when you use words, it depends what you mean by them. And when we're talking about transcendence, I would question whether a comparison between cultures is actually a transcendence, so that one can transcend culture and try and discover what lies above it or beyond it or whatever, and that's a process. I think my feeling would be that when we compare cultures, we are trying to find another way of transcending culture, so that if we look at another culture, we can see how we might transcend that culture. So in other words, we are learning to transcend culture in general by comparing cultures. I don't really feel that that comparing cultures is actually the same thing as transcendence, but I'd be pleased to hear what you feel about that.
Well, I think that is a version of the point that Professor Harrison was trying to make by distinguishing various levels. And I do find that compelling. We have to do that, but I don't think that distinction holds up ultimately. There certainly is a perfectly straightforward sense of transcending, of stepping beyond a certain limit that is traced, or stepping outside of a certain cultural framework that can be defined. And what's the difference then between that and a more radical kind of transcendence? I'm not claiming that there is fundamentally an objective difference that can be defined. We're constantly in the process of transcending whatever our points of reference are by a constant process of transformation. That is, I believe, the type of experience that opens to us the dimension of what we're calling the mystical. It's really where our fixed points of reference begin to collapse and implode. And it's not presenting us something else, which then is the transcendent. It's rather opening, this crack in our frame and experiencing the abyss of nothing. That's what it was being called yesterday. But of course, it's not a nothing that can be named nothing either. This is really where we are venturing beyond words, and that is in some sense going beyond philosophy. Not the love of wisdom, but beyond an articulate discourse such as philosophy aspires to.
Thanks so very much for that. It was really, really interesting, and thanks for the comments as well. I'm just wondering, kind of a comment, I guess, here, and wondering whether this is something similar or different. I've been thinking about that genealogy through people like Leibniz, Spinoza, Hegel, into the Heideggerian tradition, but on the German side. So I was just writing on something on Gadamer's notion of the mystical. And he, too, I think, wants to see language and culture as the medium, very much an immanentist in that sense, as the medium in which we encounter whatever we want to speak of as spiritual experience. And he's being informed by pietism and by vitalism and by his experience of poetry reading, I think, as something very similar to a cross-cultural form of linguistic transcendence. And I'm just wondering, I think, about that, where you're beyond or beyonding, which I think is a helpful thing. For him, he would say it's something like the infinity of language that gives us a medium in which we can talk about something beyond the fixed cultural space. And he really is quite serious about the idea that when we read poetry or engage in dialogue, so hence for him Socratic dialogue is a mystical practice, actually. I think similar to what we're talking about here culturally. We're opening up our awareness of language as a medium which is infinite in its potential evocation, in its internal plurality of creation, I guess, meaning constantly emerging. And also in poetry we see this kind of evocation of meanings that are very distant from our location. He talks almost about seeing a horizon tremble in the distance when we speak from within a loosened form of language. So I guess I'm just kind of wondering if that's relevant here, even though there doesn't seem to be a nothing underneath.
Well, generally, Gadamer stands in some way for the hermeneutic paradigm where everything becomes comprehensible. And there is, he does state, everything is in language becomes intelligible. In some sense, this is the line that Julien is on. Listening to you, I was also thinking of his interpretations of Celan, of Paul Celan, where he maybe is more inclined to encounter that limit, the project of truth and method, and the third part on linguistic ontology is very Hegelian, actually. And so in many ways, he's on sort of the other side, not looking to the beyond of language, but language is infinite, and I think that I'm interested in actually turning a Gadamerian approach to thinking through language inside out, to turning that inside out and being an encounter with the absolute other of language. And I do see the encounter with Paul Celan as orienting in that direction.
Thank you both very much. I just to before I ask a question of Professor Frank, just to ask Professor Harrison, and really to come back to our first key speaker, Professor McGinn, who said that it was actually everyone should learn another culture as well as their own. And I think has been, for me, and I think probably for many people here, helpful in understanding your own culture. You understand your own gold mine by seeing it from another point of view and seeing how those frames of reference are both limited in some ways and limitless in others. So I think that there's meaning in doing that, and whereas if you just stick with your own point of view, you are limited by it. I'd just like to come and ask really Professor Frank about where he sees love in this postmodern world, because it's something that you noticeably didn't talk about directly, although you referred to responsibility to others. Towards the end, how would you see love as within this, within a new framework of thought? Thank you.
Yeah, I tell you, just earlier this week, I was in a seminar in this area, Apophatic Thought and Culture, in the Divinity School in Vanderbilt, and there was one of the students, this was the time for their presentations, talked about love. And it was a revelation to me, actually, to have this really brought into the seminar. It's one of those words that works in an apophatic way to say everything and nothing. I mean, it is so pregnant, and maybe I avoid it because it is so culturally charged. When you say that word, what are you saying to who? Is so wide open. But I agree that we have to use our cultural resources, and this word love is one of our greatest cultural resources. And at the times when I do find myself, resonating to the Christian tradition but other religious traditions and even secular traditions are all about love in so many ways. It too is the unthinkable, the unsayable, that all of our words in some sense are trying to evoke. So I like that displacement. How long can we talk about transcendence or the nothing without, if we're not feeling what's also conveyed by this term love, we're going to lose interest and purpose. I think that is essential, and so I'm not going to tell you what love is, but it's one of the kinds of vocabulary that we need, I think, for this discourse.